I still remember the first time I ever laid eyes on Clarissa. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, a tiny gathering at a local restaurant where neither of us had planned on finding anything more than good food and pleasant conversation. I was immediately drawn to her warm smile, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke to the other guests. She laughed easily, told stories with an understated charm, and made everyone around her feel important. I was enchanted, to say the least. At the end of the evening, I gathered my nerves and asked if she'd like to meet for coffee sometime. She said yes. From there, we seemed to fall into step with each other as if we'd known one another for years. In those early days, our interactions were full of promise. It felt like an honest, genuine connection that neither of us had experienced before. We took spontaneous weekend trips to nearby towns, exploring antique shops and trying out small diners. We stayed up late watching old black and white movies, criticizing or praising the over-the-top acting in a shared sense of humor. Our conversations were endless, about our childhoods, our hopes for the future, random philosophical musings, or silly inside jokes. I remember thinking, again and again, that I'd finally met someone who truly saw me. She often said I made her feel the same way. It was a mutual bond that became our safe haven against the stresses of everyday life. When we decided to get married, it wasn't because of pressure from anyone or a sudden ultimatum. It simply felt right. We'd been together for 2 years, living in a modest apartment and saving up for the big day. Our wedding was a small affair held in a botanical garden, with only close friends and immediate family present. Clarissa wore a lace-trimmed dress that caught the sunlight just right, and I couldn't stop tearing up as she walked down the aisle. We exchanged vows we wrote ourselves, each promise carefully chosen to reflect the depth of our devotion. Her hands shook in mine, but her voice was sure when she said she'd love me until the day she died. I believed those words with every fiber of my being. For the first few years of our marriage, life was as close to perfect as I could imagine. We rented a cozy townhouse, adopted a small rescue dog named Milo, and settled into a routine that felt uniquely ours. Clarissa landed a position at a local marketing firm, gradually climbing the ranks, and I worked as a freelance graphic designer from our home office. Even though we had our occasional disagreements, where to spend the holidays, how to budget for a bigger place, or who should take out the garbage, it never felt like our love was in jeopardy. We made up easily, apologized sincerely, and learned from our mistakes. Our friends commented on how we seemed to complement each other's strengths and weaknesses. But as time wore on, subtle changes began to creep in. I first noticed it when Clarissa started bringing her phone everywhere, even into the shower, a habit she never had before. She said it was because she needed to stay on top of emails from work, but something about her guarded expression told me there was more to it. She'd also grown quieter in the evenings, burying herself in tasks or stepping outside to make phone calls. When I asked about it, she chalked it up to stress at the office and left it at that. I reminded myself that we all go through phases, especially in demanding jobs, so I tried to be patient and supportive, offering to cook dinner or run errands to lighten her load. Still, the emotional distance between us grew. She used to love curling up next to me with a cup of tea to watch our favorite shows, but she started disappearing after dinner, locking herself in the office under the pretense of sending off last-minute reports. Intimacy suffered as well, nights passed without any real connection, replaced by a tense silence. I questioned whether something had fundamentally changed in her feelings toward me, but every time I tried to raise the subject, Clarissa either insisted everything was fine or got defensive, accusing me of overanalyzing. It got to a point where I felt more like a roommate than a husband, a silent occupant she tolerated rather than someone she loved. Despite my suspicions, I had no concrete evidence that she was hiding anything truly damaging. Then came the day everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was finishing up a design project for a local restaurant chain. My phone buzzed, and I glanced down to see Clarissa's name flashing on the screen. A grin spread across my face. I hadn't heard from her all day, so maybe she was texting something sweet or giving me an update on her schedule. But the moment I opened the message, my blood ran cold. The text read, "I can't stop thinking about last night. You were incredible. Same time tomorrow? My husband thinks I'm working late again." I froze, reading it once, twice, 3 times, trying to convince myself there was some misunderstanding. But the words were undeniably clear. For a moment, I thought this might be a bad joke, or that Clarissa's phone had been hacked. Then my rational mind kicked in. The text mentioned her husband, me, directly, as if clarifying to the recipient that she had a ready-made alibi. My heart pounded so violently I thought I might collapse. I read it again, searching for any detail that could be interpreted differently, but it was explicit enough to leave little doubt. She'd spent the previous night with someone else, someone who apparently left her wanting more. The knowledge stabbed through my chest like a jagged knife. The phone almost slipped from my hand as the rush of adrenaline and hurt surged. My eyes stung with tears, but I blinked them back, consumed by a swirl of rage, shock, and heartbreak. I stared at the screen, my mind racing with questions. How could she do this? How long had it been going on? Was I blind to the obvious? My stomach churned. I decided right then that I wouldn't confront her immediately. Instead, I'd gather every piece of evidence I could, so when I finally showed her what I knew, there'd be no room for lies or manipulation. On the one hand, a part of me wanted to yell at her through the phone, hurl accusations until my throat was raw. But the bigger part of me recognized that I needed to approach this with caution. I forced myself to stand up from my desk, walk into the kitchen, and splash water on my face. My reflection in the stainless steel sink showed a man on the brink of collapse, eyes wild with betrayal. I remember telling myself to get it together, to not let emotions completely derail me. If Clarissa texted me by mistake, she'd soon realize the error. She'd likely try to cover her tracks. Indeed, not 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Clarissa. I let it go to voicemail because I needed time to collect my thoughts. Her message was brief but frantic. "Hey, I'm so sorry, that text was a joke from a coworker's phone. We were just messing around, you know how silly people can be. I'll explain everything when I get home, okay? Love you." The explanation was feeble and contradicted the fact it came from her own number. My hands trembled with renewed anger at how quickly she tried to spin a story. By the time she got home, I'd already checked her phone records online. It was shockingly easy to see a new number that appeared frequently, at all hours, early mornings, late nights, weekends. The logs confirmed my worst fears. Not only had she texted and called this number hundreds of times in the past couple of months, but the pattern of timing lined up exactly with the nights she said she was bogged down at work. I felt nauseated scrolling through the data, my imagination filling in details I didn't want to picture. But I pressed on, screenshotting every record, methodically compiling a timeline of her deceit. I knew confrontation was inevitable, but I also knew I wanted to do it on my terms, in a way that exposed her lies completely. Clarissa arrived home around 6, carrying a bag of groceries like she was trying too hard to appear domestic and innocent. She paused in the doorway, eyes darting around. I stood in the kitchen, arms folded, managing a neutral expression. She flashed me a nervous smile, that same one I used to find so endearing. Now it felt like a mockery. Before I could speak, she launched into her fabricated explanation about how a friend at work borrowed her phone during lunch to play a prank, and how she felt humiliated that it reached me. She insisted this friend typed the message and sent it as a twisted joke. The more she spoke, the more her words twisted my stomach. She peppered her story with forced details, trying to sell it as a misunderstanding. Maybe she believed I was gullible enough to accept her excuses at face value. I listened quietly, my face revealing little. When she finished, I nodded slowly and said, "That's quite a story. You sure that's everything?" She tried to maintain eye contact but faltered. Her voice grew shaky as she forced a smile. "Yes, of course. Why would I lie to you?" she asked. I could hear the slight tremor in her tone. A tug of war raged inside me. Part of me wanted to fling the phone records in her face, shout about how stupid she must think I am. But I needed a better stage, a bigger impact, somewhere she couldn't wiggle out with half-truths or partial confessions. I simply replied, "All right. If there's nothing else to say, then let's leave it at that for now," and I left the room. She must have been relieved, thinking her deceitful performance had succeeded. In the days that followed, Clarissa did everything she could to appear affectionate and attentive. She started making me breakfast, which she hadn't done in months, asked about my work projects, and tried to cuddle next to me at night. But each gesture felt hollow to me, a desperate attempt to maintain a facade. Meanwhile, I busied myself with a new plan. Her parents' anniversary celebration was coming up the following week, a big family event at a local country club. Clarissa's mother had mentioned it to me months prior, inviting all close relatives, plus some of their friends, to celebrate 30 years of marriage. I remembered Clarissa emphasizing how important it was for us to both be there. This would be the perfect setting to bring everything to light. I know it sounds vindictive, but I was past caring about social propriety. I wanted everyone to see her for who she really was. I wanted the shock and humiliation to mirror what she'd done to me. Whether it was right or wrong from a moral standpoint barely mattered in my state of betrayal. So, I laid out the steps. First, I'd act normal and pretend her story had satisfied me. Second, I'd copy all the phone records, plus the accidental text message, onto a thumb drive. Third, at the moment I deemed most opportune during her parents' anniversary event, would expose it all. Clarissa had no clue. She pranced around the house, humming a tune, occasionally looking at me with a hint of wariness but largely convinced she'd dodged a bullet. She mentioned once that her coworker felt terrible for sending that text, a detail she added to bolster her lie. I forced a smile and said I understood how silly jokes could happen. The relief in her eyes made me realize how deeply she'd underestimated me. As the anniversary party drew closer, I found myself oscillating between nerves and a grim satisfaction at what was to come. On the day of the event, we drove separately because Clarissa said she needed to arrive early to help set up decorations with her mother. I used that as an excuse, telling her I had errands to run first. In reality, I spent the extra time making final preparations. I carried a laptop in my trunk, all my evidence easily accessible. My hands trembled when I thought about the confrontations that might erupt, but I knew I needed to see this through. I couldn't live with the charade any longer. The country club was nestled amid manicured lawns and flowerbeds, with a large banquet hall overlooking a small lake. Cars lined the parking area, and the sound of chatter drifted from the open doors as I approached. I found Clarissa standing with her parents, greeting guests. She wore a pale blue dress that, under different circumstances, would have found stunning on her. When she saw me, she waved, and I returned the gesture with a polite smile. Her mother gave me a warm hug, thanking me for coming. Clarissa's father clapped me on the shoulder, asking how life was treating us. It tore me up inside to lie to these kind people who'd always welcomed me into their family. But I had no intention of letting that guilt deter me. Inside, the hall was decorated with flowers, strings of fairy lights, and framed photos of her parents over the years. A slideshow played on a screen, showing highlights from their 30-year journey together. People mingled, sipping champagne, nibbling hors d'oeuvres, and talking excitedly about the couple's long-lasting love. I tried to keep my composure, though the irony bit at me. Clarissa was all smiles, guiding elderly relatives to their seats, speaking animatedly about how her parents were the embodiment of true marital devotion. My stomach churned. This was the woman who'd lied to me about an affair, who'd texted me by accident about her tryst and tried to spin it into a joke. The hypocrisy was staggering. After about an hour, everyone was seated at round tables for dinner. I had coordinated with the DJ earlier, explaining that I had a special presentation for Clarissa's parents, something that would require plugging my laptop into the hall's AV system. The DJ hadn't asked many questions. He assumed it was part of the surprise to commemorate the big anniversary. Once dinner started wrapping up, I slipped away from the table, giving Clarissa a quick nod that I was going to speak with the DJ. She seemed curious but not overly suspicious. Maybe she thought I was planning some sentimental slideshow for her parents. I approached the DJ booth, set up my laptop, and tested the connection. My heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. When I returned to my seat, Clarissa's mother was about to begin a speech, thanking everyone for coming. After she spoke, her father said a few words about the joys and trials of marriage, praising Clarissa for being a wonderful daughter and me for being a supportive son-in-law. My face burned with shame. If only he knew. He ended his speech by inviting any guests to share their own well-wishes or stories. That was my cue. Standing up, I cleared my throat, feeling every eye in the room shift to me. "I'd like to say a few words," I began, my voice cracking slightly. I could see Clarissa's puzzled expression, but she offered a small smile, presumably thinking I was about to deliver a sweet tribute to her parents. "This is a special day," I continued, forcing calm into my tone. 30 years of marriage is a significant milestone. I've always admired how you two, Elaine and Robert, have stood by each other through good times and bad. The love and trust you share is something many of us aspire to have." A ripple of appreciative murmurs went around the table. I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat, then went on, "I, too, believed I shared that same unwavering trust with your daughter. But recently, I discovered otherwise." Clarissa stiffened, her eyes widening. A hush fell upon the crowd. She accidentally sent me a text message meant for someone else. I let the statement hang in the air, seeing confusion cross her parents' faces. Clarissa shook her head slightly, her lips forming the word no without sound. I pressed forward. "That text made it very clear she's been unfaithful. She's been seeing another man, lying about it, and, well, she tried to pass it off as a joke from a coworker. But there's more to it than that." A stunned silence engulfed the room, broken only by the DJ's voice stammering, "Do you want me to, turn off the microphone?" I shook my head. "No, I have something to show everyone." I walked to the DJ booth, ignoring Clarissa's panicked calls of my name. In her eyes, I saw a raw fear. She stood up, almost knocking her chair over, but I began playing a short slideshow, photos of phone call logs, the explicit text message, and a timeline of nights she claimed to work late, all neatly aligned. I'd even managed to take a few screenshots from her phone, which she'd left unlocked for a few seconds one day while charging. They showed short but damning snippets of her conversations with the other man, referencing secret meetings. My heart hammered as the images flicked across the large screen, visible to every person in that banquet hall. Gasps and murmurs rose around the room. Clarissa's mother stared in shock, her mouth parted, while her father's face darkened with anger. Relatives exchanged horrified glances, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Clarissa ran toward me, eyes brimming with tears, begging me to stop. She tried to reach the laptop, but I stepped in her way. "How could you do this here?" she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, don't do this in front of my parents." The desperation in her voice might have moved me under different circumstances, but the memory of that text and her ongoing lies hardened my resolve. I let the slideshow finish. When it ended, there was a beat of stunned silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then Clarissa's mother let out a strangled sob, and Clarissa's father slammed a fist on the table, rattling the silverware. Whispered conversations erupted among the guests. Some glared at Clarissa with disgust, others looked at me with pity. Clarissa buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I stepped away from the DJ booth, letting the images remain frozen on the final screen, a close-up of her text referencing me as her oblivious husband. "Why?" Robert demanded, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage as he looked at his daughter. Elaine, tears streaking her face, stood speechless. Clarissa had no immediate answer. She just cried, murmuring apologies that seemed to bounce off the room's walls without finding any acceptance. A cousin attempted to comfort Elaine, while a friend of Clarissa's stared daggers at her. The tension was like a tangible presence, pressing down on everyone. Clarissa turned to me, mascara running down her cheeks. "We can fix this," she pleaded, voice choked with sobs. "Please, talk to me in private. Let me explain." I felt a swirl of emotions, heartbreak, rage, and a grim sense of victory that I'd finally exposed her deception. I shook my head slowly. "I think we're past explanations. You had your chance to tell me the truth, and you chose to lie. Over and over. This is your mess. Own it." She tried to grab my arm, but I pulled away, turning toward her parents. "I'm sorry to do this on your anniversary," I said, voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain composed. "You both deserved a celebration of your enduring love, but your daughter left me no choice. I couldn't sit by and pretend everything was fine." Elaine let out another sob, hugging her husband as if needing support to stay upright. Robert's shoulders heaved with silent fury, glancing between me and Clarissa, clearly torn between paternal protectiveness and disgust at his daughter's betrayal. The aftermath was a chaotic swirl of people trying to comfort Clarissa's parents, others awkwardly filing out of the room, unable to handle the tension. Clarissa stood isolated, tears falling, her breath coming in gasps. I slipped away, finding a quiet corner near the exit. My hands were shaking, and I realized my face was damp with tears I hadn't consciously felt. As humiliating and dramatic as the scene had been, a part of me felt relieved, a sick sense of closure, knowing the truth was out in the open. There was no more pretending, no more living with the gnawing suspicion that my wife was lying to me daily. After a few minutes, Clarissa approached me, her steps slow and unsteady. Her face was pale, eyes red and swollen. "You've destroyed my family," she managed, voice raw. "Couldn't we have handled this privately?" Her accusation stung, lighting a spark of anger in me again. "You did that yourself," I said, my tone shaking. "All I did was reveal the truth. You're the one who lied and cheated. You're the one who destroyed what we had, not me." She whispered something about how we could go to therapy, how she was just confused, and how the affair didn't mean anything compared to our marriage. But the feeble words fell flat. I looked at her, remembering the bright-eyed woman I'd married, feeling a wave of sadness for what we'd lost. Then I thought about the text she accidentally sent, the flippant reference to me as a clueless husband. My resolve hardened. I told her it was over. I couldn't trust her, nor did I want to. She tried to argue, but I walked away. In the following days, the fallout spread. Her parents, humiliated in front of friends and family, avoided Clarissa's calls. They reached out to me, apologizing for their daughter's behavior, telling me I was still welcome in their home anytime. I felt sorry for them, sorry their anniversary was overshadowed by such betrayal. As for Clarissa, she moved out to stay with a friend. We barely spoke, except for logistical matters about splitting bank accounts, deciding who would keep Milo, our little dog, and other mundane but necessary arrangements when a marriage collapses. Though part of me felt vindicated, the emotional toll was enormous. I spent nights replaying the entire arc of our relationship, from our first date to the moment I saw that damning text. I wondered if we could have saved our marriage had she confessed earlier, had I noticed the warning signs sooner, or if our love had simply been a fragile illusion. Ultimately, though, the endless what-ifs didn't matter. The betrayal was real, the lies too extensive. I filed for divorce a few weeks after the anniversary fiasco. The legal process moved quickly since we had no children together and only a modest set of assets to divide. During one tense meeting with our respective lawyers, Clarissa asked if we could talk privately for a moment. The attorneys stepped out, leaving us in a small conference room. She broke down in tears, saying she'd never meant to hurt me like this, that she wished she could take it all back, that she was lonely, confused, and felt like she needed excitement in her life. She claimed the affair was more about escaping boredom than love. As I listened, I recognized elements of truth in her words. Maybe we'd settled into a routine that lacked passion. Maybe we stopped communicating as deeply as we once had. But none of those reasons justified months of deception and the cruelty of her attempts to gaslight me after sending that text. I told her as much, my voice hollow. There was no animosity left in me, just a heavy resignation. She cried harder, apologizing again, begging for a second chance. If she had shown that remorse from the start, before weaving her web of lies, might I have been more open to reconciliation? Perhaps. But after everything that transpired, the sneaking around, the humiliating attempts to cover up her affair, the disrespect, my feelings for her had curdled into something unrecognizable. I couldn't find it in myself to love her again. We parted ways, both of us emotionally drained, our lawyers re-entering the room to wrap up the formalities. I moved out of the townhouse, renting a small one-bedroom apartment across town. Milo came with me, and for weeks, the two of us navigated a strange new normal. Friends checked in on me, offering sympathy or scolding me for the dramatic way I exposed Clarissa. But most understood that, while my method was extreme, my heartbreak was even more so. Some friends had known Clarissa and couldn't fathom how she'd done this. Others admitted they'd seen little red flags in her behavior but never wanted to interfere. I realized then that every marriage has hidden cracks that outsiders only glimpse in passing. In quiet moments, I'd recall the day Clarissa and I met, the sweet awkwardness of that first spark. I'd recall our wedding vows, the way she promised fidelity and honesty. The memory felt like a cruel joke now. Healing was slow, a process of learning to trust myself again, to believe I hadn't been a fool for loving her. Therapy helped a bit. I spoke to a counselor about my anger, my shame, and my fear of ever trusting someone again. She advised me to see the affair as Clarissa's failure, not mine, a reflection of her inability to communicate rather than any shortcoming in me. That perspective offered some relief. Meanwhile, Clarissa tried reaching out on occasion, sending long emails filled with remorse and attempts at an explanation. I skimmed them, but I didn't respond. I'd made my choice to move forward without her. The divorce finalized a few months later, relatively drama-free compared to the explosive revelation that triggered it. On the day I signed the last document, I felt a wave of sadness, but also a sense of release. The door to our life together had closed with a resounding thud. People sometimes ask if I regret exposing her in such a public manner. It's a complicated question. On one hand, it was undeniably harsh, and it hurt many people besides Clarissa, her parents, especially, who'd done nothing to deserve such humiliation on their anniversary. But on the other hand, the fury I felt at being deceived ran so deep that private confrontation wouldn't have given me the same closure. I wanted the world to see her betrayal. I wanted her to experience the shock I'd felt when she accidentally sent me that text. In the end, it was an ugly scenario any way you slice it. Infidelity rarely ends gracefully. Though time has softened the initial intensity of my pain, I still carry the scars. Every so often, I see Clarissa's face in an old photo and feel a pang of nostalgia for the version of her I thought I knew, for the relationship I believed was built on honesty. But I remind myself that people can change or reveal sides of themselves we never suspected. It's part of the risk of love. You can't guarantee someone won't hurt you. All you can do is pick up the pieces if they do. Ironically, the part of me that most longs for a stable relationship again is also the part most terrified of experiencing another betrayal. Yet, I refuse to let her actions define the rest of my life. The best I can do is remain open to the possibility of love, while being wiser about the warning signs. Betrayal taught me to look deeper, to communicate more openly, and to never ignore my gut when something feels off. I've heard rumors that Clarissa moved to a different city, possibly to start fresh. Some say she's still seeing the man she had the affair with, others say it ended abruptly. I don't particularly care either way. Her choices are no longer my concern. I've worked hard to rebuild my sense of self, to discover new hobbies and passions, to spend time with people who genuinely value honesty. Sometimes, my phone buzzes with a message, and I feel a brief jolt of anxiety, recalling that day I received her mistaken text. But then I breathe and remember that moment is behind me, a grim chapter closed. Despite the heartbreak, I can acknowledge that uncovering the truth, no matter how painful, was necessary. Living with illusions would have been far worse in the long run. I confronted her betrayal in a way that left no room for denial, and while it devastated many people, it also set me free from continuing a hollow marriage. In that sense, as brutal as it was the only path forward I could handle. Now, when I look back, I realize that text message was more than just a mistaken dispatch. It was the turning point that shattered any illusions I still clung to about our relationship. Clarissa's attempts to cover it up only confirmed my decision. While some might say I took it too far by exposing her in front of her entire family, I believe she sealed her own fate the moment she sent that text meant for her lover. Betrayal has consequences, and sometimes they unfold in a dramatic, irreversible manner. In my story, that's precisely what happened. And while the fallout was painful, I can at least say I'm no longer living a lie. In the end, that's all the closure I needed.